Hi there, my name is Memo. This is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me. It's tropical houseplants. So if I was to tell you that plants can scream, they can hear, and they can also get affected by anesthesia, have I piqued your interest just yet? Let's look at some interesting new research that has come out on plants that could mean big breakthroughs in how we deal with houseplants moving forward. So this is obviously a continuation video from the first research article video that I did a while back. I'll link it at the top there. And we're looking at some interesting articles. I think if I'm not mistaken, I have got 5. And I've got my trusty iPad because I'm never going to remember this off the top of my head. But we've got one where there is research that's been done about plants being able to hear and being able to respond to vibrations. Another one where there is an article that talks about plants learning and decision making as well as communication. The possibility, and this is where it starts getting really quite mind-blowing, the possibility of plant consciousness, because we've talked about this on the previous video as well, and then that kind of concept of plants being able to emit sounds or ultrasounds out for people to hear. Or not people, other plants generally. So let's move into the first article, and I will have links for all of these down below if you want to go and check them out. So the first one is talking a bit more about the concept of plant consciousness. And by that I mean this was based on an experiment that was conducted where, if I'm not mistaken, the plants, so the Mimosa pudica, so the sensitive plant, was put into, I think it was a jar or something along those lines, and it was pumped with anesthetic gas to see its effects. And yes, the plant was affected by this gas specifically, so it kind of slowed down its reactivity rates as well. And there was a lot of experiments that were done that were conducted in order to explore that possibility of plant consciousness. And it's kind of interesting to see this when it comes to plants as well, because there's a lot of obviously awareness of the consciousness of animals. But I think the kind of vast thinking for a long period of time is that plants didn't have a consciousness of being kind of that conscious mind. So, or thought process. It's really bizarre of me talking about mind and thought processes with plants, but you kind of get where I'm going with this a bit. So the article goes on to say that a lot of researchers have seen through this research that plants can go ahead and make really complex decisions, and they also can learn and communicate with each other. And there's another article that talks about that communication aspect, despite not having that nervous system that humans and animals might do. So that is quite interesting. Take a beat to think about that. So one of the experiments was talking about the pea plant specifically. I mean, most of these things aren't necessarily all going to be relating specifically to house plants, but we can see the implications to our plants as well, because they are plants as well. They might not be the vegetable plants that some of these experiments might be kind of dealt with. And as I mentioned in the previous video, a lot of these experiments are done on kind of the vegetable plants because there's big money in that. The vegetable production worldwide for consumption by humans is worth billions. So it kind of makes sense that the research would be done to that, because that would be the first line of use for that kind of research to be utilized, essentially. But doesn't stop us from being able to utilize some of that information that's coming out for some of our own plants around us. So as I was saying, one of the experiments was done on a pea plant, and they were able to demonstrate the ability of the plant to make decisions based on essentially risk assessment of a situation, and being able to choose nutrient-rich soil over nutrient-poor soil. take that for a moment to kind of let that really sink in. Coming back to the Mimosa podica thing and the kind of sensitive plant, and again, I'm quite glad I've written down some of these notes because otherwise I would have never remembered. They showed that exposing it to harmless stimuli on a regular basis, like for instance being dropped from a short height, after repeating that exposure, it seems to have recollected and kept that in its memory. Remember, we talk about memory in plants here as well, like again. So the really interesting thing, and it's something that the scientists have kind of gone on to argue, is that that plant consciousness, because there isn't that centralized nervous system there, could be an example of what they call distributed cognition. Big word alert. And it just means that the information being processed and the decision making are spread throughout the entire organism rather than the central nervous system. It obviously doesn't have a central nervous system. It needs to be able to process this somehow, but it does it as a whole, which is again really cool. Obviously, the article that I was reading wasn't the direct scientific article, although I think it was a New Scientist article. Yeah, so there's probably the link there that you can kind of follow back. This is a controversial topic. Some people will be like, are you quacks talking about this? But there is some groundbreaking experiments that are taking part, and we're seeing certain reactions to things that I don't think people were expecting from plants. But let's think about what this might mean for us for a moment, what it might mean for our collection, for our houseplants. So, and I'll kind of link it back to the previous video because it was one of the articles that was talking about the fact that touching plants is a big no-no because it does affect them, and a lot of people were really worried that I touch my plants all the time, I can't stop touching my plants. With that bit of information and this bit of information, like when we were looking at with the sensitive plant that eventually kind of dulled down its reaction to certain things, it might be one of those situations that if your plants are really super used to you touching them, eventually it probably won't affect them quite as much. So there is that's a bonus. But it is really interesting to kind of think about that consciousness that's going on, especially with us, because most of our plants are in their own pots and their own substrates. If you think about it, they're kind of in their own little sterile bubble. Not sterile, but in their own little bubble. In nature, they would have a lot more different things to interact with and be able to, again, make those conscious decisions. This is going to sound so weird at the beginning of the video as well, but hopefully I'm not coming across as a quack. I am just kind of talking you through research that actual scientists have done. But it's just kind of being aware of that, because if there is that kind of consciousness and they can recognize things in their environment, it means that they're aware of things that might be around them as well. So it might be a case that if you're putting a plant next to some other plants and all of a sudden you're seeing it flourish, yes, and we've been talking about this for a while, that sometimes you get pockets of humidity if you're grouping plants together, but it might also be that if one of those plants is struggling with a pest and somehow you're going, how are the rest of these not affected by this? There might be signals that are happening there, and they might be learning from each other, especially when they're in close vicinity to each other, going, oh, that one's actually dealing with pests. Do I need to produce chemical A, B, or C in order to be less desirable to pests because that is in my immediate environment? So that is kind of interesting. So one of the other articles, which again is on the same lines, all of these will be linked down below, talking about plant awareness, goes a step further and actually delves into that kind of awareness and what I was just talking about now, that interconnectedness of being aware of what's in their surrounding environment and other plants as well. So it went on to kind of delve deeper into the kind of awareness that these plants might have, not just to other plants, but towards animals as well, and also some complex chemical signals that they might be releasing that means that they can recognize and communicate with each other. One of the things that this second bit of research was able to kind of pinpoint a bit further is that they're a lot more aware of certain stimuli around them, like for instance, gravity, light, and humidity, and be able to adjust their growth based on these things. And I mean, obviously, If it's got higher humidity, does it grow better? Yes, we've all experienced this, but we've not been doing this in the scientific form, basically. The gravity one is quite interesting, and I do encourage you to check out that link down below. But it is one of those things that is quite interesting to see that plants aren't just things that live there and they just keep on keeping on the same way that they're doing. They are, based on some of this research that's coming out, much more complex beings than we thought they were, and how they can kind of interact with the world around them and how much they can understand and how much they can actually respond to that. So one of the things that they kind of mentioned as an example, and anybody who's owned a Venus flytrap might be able to recognize this, is how plants can learn from certain stimuli and maybe when to ignore them. So for instance, with a Venus flytrap, if a drop of water from rain or when you're watering around drops on the actual trap itself, it learns to recognize that and not close because it's not a fly. Obviously, we know there's an extra layer to that because anybody who's owned Venus flytraps, I think there's these trichomes that are happening on the inside of the trap itself. And I don't know if you've ever done this experiment yourself. So if you touch one of those hairs, nothing will happen. If you touch a couple of them, because for the plant it would signal that it's a fly, then it would close up because it makes sense. If a Venus flytrap keeps closing every time there's any form of stimuli on the trap, that takes an awful lot of energy away from the plant. And if it's not going to get a meal essentially afterwards, it's kind of wasting its energy. Again, huge levels of energy to be able to kind of create that fast movement. So there is that to recognize. This second bit of research also goes on to describe the fact that there is, and I can't believe this is a thing, and I also don't believe I've never heard of it before, there is a kind of emerging field, and I think this bit of research was slightly older basically, but of plant neurobiology as a field. I would imagine there's probably not that many scientists within this, but did any of you know that this was a thing that people were kind of really looking into? So obviously any kind of information like this and any kind of research like this has an overarching effect, not just to kind of the plants that they're researching, but as I mentioned earlier on, towards agriculture, towards conservation. All of these things are kind of key to being able to better adapt and better deal with the plants around each of our spaces, basically. So again, coming into that kind of notion of how plants might be able to distinguish something. So let me give you an example that I think some people may have noticed. So do you have a house plant? And again, this is me assuming things here, but I'm trying to see how I can link it in my own head in terms of the research and how it might apply to real life world, and hopefully this makes sense to all of you as well. So say for instance you've got a space in your house where there's a lot of foot traffic all the time and you've got a plant there and it's constantly getting bashed every time somebody goes by. Yes, you would probably get a leaf with some mechanical damage. I don't know if anybody has noticed this. I have, where if a plant, say I've got a monstera, I'm trying to think if I've got a plant that I can easily show you. So yeah, say I've got this Esmeralda here, and say this bit of plant here, I kept bashing it, and I kept bashing it, and I kept bashing it every time I went by. What might happen is, yes, you're going to get some mechanical damage on that leaf there as well, but what I also find a lot of the times is that plant might then eventually put out another leaf to fill up the gap if that leaf drops down. Or, and most of the time, what I seem to find is that the plant kind of eventually learns and goes, all I'm going to do there is going to end up losing a leaf because there's constantly something pushing on that leaf. I'm not going to grow more leaves there. I'm going to grow them somewhere else. So that is quite interesting to see how some of these things could affect us in the houseplant community as well. Another bit of research that was done, which is kind of exciting actually, and this is for all those impatient people out there like myself, who don't do well with flow plants. And again, as I said, this is probably going to get used for vegetable growing first, I would imagine, when they start doing applications of this. But they are looking into the genes of, I think it's duckweed? Yeah, duckweed, which is, I did not know this, one of the fastest growing plants out there. Obviously, it's quite small and it's a plant that grows within water, basically. But they've been able to kind of do further research into the genome of this plant now to kind of understand a bit more about what makes it fast. And something that a lot of people might not know about duckweed is because it grows so fast, there has been some discussion around for a while on whether or not this could be a fast, effective, and kind of least impact possible way of being able to get large quantities of protein for nutrition as well. And also, if I'm not mistaken, it's not just the protein element and kind of being fed, but also being used as biofuel. What the research also kind of found, obviously, they found genes that kind of speed up its growth rate, but they were also able to find in duckweed certain genes that don't exist in other plants, where they were able to link it and kind of say those genes are kind of relating to slower speed of growth in some plants. So you could imagine research like this is crucial in being able to actually be utilized by agriculture to have slightly more sustainable and less impactful to the environment solutions for food production, basically, and that kind of biofuel that I was talking about. Now, yes, we are talking about, I would imagine, some form of a GMO when this kind of comes in, because you're going to be looking at gene kind of manipulation with some of these plants that might be coming in. And as I said, it's probably going to be predominantly to the agricultural side of things, but there are kind of potentially going to be some maybe benefits that are going to happen further down the line for things like houseplants. The other thing as well that is quite interesting with kind of research like this is I think duckweed can be quite invasive in certain waterways and stuff like that. So learning a bit more about its growth rate and kind of what makes it do that in terms of genetics could help a lot of the people out there who are trying to minimize its kind of aggressiveness within certain kind of waterways and things like that. So that's always going to be a positive thing. But as I said, imagine this. So this is going to be something that probably will be used for vegetables first, if they're going to be triggering things like switching off the genes that make it for a slower growth, or being able to somehow implement those faster growing genes into other kind of agricultural produce. The interesting thing, I'm talking specifically about being able to switch off genes that might slow down growth rates. Can you just imagine if at some point that trickles down to something like houseplants? And I'm thinking of one of the slowest houseplants that I know, with two actually, which is the cast iron plant, so the Aspidistra elater, I think, and the Zamioculcas zamifolia, the ZZ plant, both of which could be exceptionally slow plants. Now, if the slowness for those plants relates to those genes that could potentially be switched off, it might not be in our lifetime, it might be in our kids' lifetime. We might see things like the ZZ plant or the cast iron plant becoming some of the fastest growing plants in the houseplant market. It also might mean that if they can switch off, we've had this discussion on some of my plant review series videos as well, where some of these plants that grow exceptionally slowly, if there's a high demand for them, it will generally mean that they will fetch a much higher price because they take so much longer to get to a sellable size, and it costs a lot more money when you're buying it. Potentially, and again, this is stretching it as much as I can possibly stretch it, but if they could introduce some of that switching off of the slow growing genes on some of these plants, we might be able to get bigger influxes of them out into the market. And I'm obviously talking about the commercial market here as well. But let's take a step back and think about conservation as well here. So say, for instance, there's a plant that might be on an endangered list somewhere out in the wild, and they're trying to reintroduce it back into nature, but it's a very slow growing plant. So there is that point of, by the time that plant has naturally grown, it might its location might no longer be there, basically, because it grows as slow as it does. If they can potentially speed up some of those plants, it might mean that we might get to keep them for a bit longer. Obviously, a lot of these things are very theoretical, and they're things that are coming out of my brain at the moment, and I'm sure if the scientists out there might turn around and say, "Remember, you are talking rubbish," I do encourage you, let me know in the comments down below. I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just trying to connect point A to point B and what it might mean for us in the houseplant kind of world. The next article that I kind of did a bit of a deep dive on was an article that was looking into research around the concept of plants being able to hear. And by hear, it means respond to certain kind of vibrational frequencies. This video is like kind of all over the place, but hopefully this is all kind of making sense and it's interesting for everybody. So some of the studies talking about there are plants out there that can respond to kind of frequencies and vibrations around them and respond accordingly. Again, touching into that cognizant area that we were talking about before, is they can respond in terms of their growth, in terms of their speed. All of these things can be affected by some of these vibrations. It's not everything, and obviously there's still a lot more research that needs to be done in this field. But one of the things that they found, which was quite interesting, was that corn seedlings, and let me just pick up my iPad again because I need to remember the specifics. So the researchers found that the roots of corn seedlings responded to specific frequencies, growing towards a continuous frequency of between 200 and 300 hertz. So as somebody who's going to be growing corn quite soon, because I've got seedlings starting up, that's exceptionally interesting to me. So I will be looking into that a bit more in detail, and I might even do a bit of an experiment myself. I don't know how I'm going to be able to create that frequency there, but watch this space, maybe? One of the update videos for the allotment might be me doing crazy scientists with my plants. So another part of the study was looking at a parasitic plant, I think called the dodder plant. I've never heard of it before. But that's a plant that they have found is able to respond to the frequencies of its host plants and grow towards it because of those frequencies. So it kind of recognizes that that is its host plant. This can kind of maybe touch base again based on that first video when we were talking about that mimicry plant, that they were just like, can it see, or is it dealing with frequencies that it's getting? The big thing with that old article from the first video is they also put it on an artificial plant that has no frequency. How was it able to copy that? But I do love all these little bits of research that are coming out because they're quite interesting, things that we probably had never thought of, and what it could mean for even like the simple plants that we're growing at home. The study obviously discovered that these plants are reacting to these frequencies or vibrations in a way that to us, if we humanize it, looks like hearing. The bigger debate now is, are they classing it as hearing, or are they just classing it as being able to respond to stimuli? Regardless, that's quite interesting because it generally means that those plants do interact with their wider environment, basically. And it might not be all plants, and it might be all plants and we just haven't figured it out yet. But it's really interesting that the scientists are kind of going into this much detail to figure this out. Again, because of the potential benefits that it might have to things like agriculture. So for instance, what I was talking about with those corn seedlings, can you imagine if they figure out certain frequencies for a lot of these vegetables that work to stimulate kind of more consistent growth or faster growth or better yields, all of these things, and they start implementing this in some of the food crops that they're growing for the wider consumption of the world. The interesting thing that needs to then be discussed at that point, because obviously we're talking, I kind of mentioned before about GMO foods, would something like that be considered a GMO food? Or would it not? Would it still be theoretically considered organic because you are growing a plant, you're not introducing chemicals? I'm not 100% au fait with the definition of what organic is, but would it still be technically considered organic if they were able to kind of promote these frequencies around these plants to make them grow faster? Something to kind of consider. But again, think for a moment, and I'll touch this in terms of our world. If plants were able to respond to certain kind of vibrational or kind of frequencies around them, think about what that might potentially mean for pest management. So is there a frequency that a lot of plants might respond to that means that they are better at repelling their own pests, of releasing the pheromones that they need to release in order to repel those pests or become less desirable for those pests. Because, and I know this is huge conjecture here, can you imagine? Oh God, I know how many people would buy this. Can you imagine if we could all just buy a little plug-in frequency emitter which would guarantee we'd have no pests on our houseplants? If that is a thing and anybody ever creates it, 100% they're going to become a millionaire. 100%. Obviously, it's not going to be done for houseplants first. Obviously, it will probably be for something like agricultural crops again, because pests are a big problem. They could lose huge yields, especially if you're growing at a large scale, especially indoors in like kind of glass houses or even polytunnels. But then they can kind of do this. Can you imagine? Because eventually, if that technology is generated for agriculture, eventually it will trickle down to houseplant hobbyists like ourselves, because the frequency is a frequency. As long as they can generate a machine that can generate that frequency reliably, that can easily just be plugged in, it won't necessarily stop all pests from coming there, but you're kind of like, it's very similar to, it's really interesting because you'd kind of almost relate it back to, and I'm from a warm country where we suffer a lot from mosquitoes a lot of the times, and I don't know if anybody is from a warm country where you can get those plug-in diffusory things to kind of repel mosquitoes. Similar to that, obviously it's not diffusing anything, it is kind of like sending out frequencies. I think they've got similar things for rats and cockroaches that you can plug in. I don't know how well those things work, but this is a slightly different scenario. What I'm talking about is potentially frequencies to trigger the plant's natural defenses to strengthen against pests. It's not eliminating the pest itself, it's just making it sure that these plants are as prepared, their defenses are up as possible for a potential plant pest invasion. This is such an interesting topic. I find it really interesting. I'm really hoping you do, and I'm not the weirdo that's talking about all these articles. So I'll wrap up with the final bit of research, and I've definitely got my trusty iPad here as well, purely because this is something that came up. If anybody's on TikTok, this came up on a few people's TikToks recently, including mine. But I thought I'd kind of dive into it and actually look at the article. And this is the concept of whether or not plants can scream. Pinch of salt, because these are sensational topics for people to want to read these articles. But what essentially has happened is that scientists have been able to discover that certain plants emit ultrasonic sounds in very rapid bursts to signal when they are stressed, which is kind of interesting. And kind of the stress levels that they're kind of talking to is whether or not they were being cut or there was a lack of water, specifically, basically. So the study went on to use kind of microphones to be able to detect these sounds or these frequencies coming off the plants. And specifically, I think it was tomato and tobacco plants. And obviously these screams are inaudible to the human ear. Otherwise, we would have been hearing this for ages. My plants would be screaming bloody murder to me on a regular basis. Oh my God, I think this might end up triggering people again, like I did on my previous video, when everybody was just like, my plants are looking at me? What? Your plants are also screaming at you, apparently. They're screaming at all of us. But yeah, the range that the kind of frequencies were at about 20 to 100 kilohertz, basically. The interesting thing that they did find as well is that this frequency intensified as well, depending on the intensity of the stimulus. The really interesting thing about this bit of research and that kind of level of being able to at least be aware of these frequencies is potentially a really good way of being able to monitor plants' health. And again, I will link it into the benefits towards agriculture. But again, same thing that I was talking about before, if they could emit a frequency that would make plants be more kind of naturally defending themselves against pests, this could work in the other way around, of people being able to listen in for certain frequencies to see if the plants were being stressed and potentially act as an early warning sign for things that might need to be treated, which is really, really quite cool. So if we think about this specifically about houseplants, again, imagine like the device that I was talking about before. If there's something along the lines of a device that could hear out for some of these frequencies, it might be something that we can carry around in our hands. Think of the kind of light meters that you can kind of do, and being able to kind of almost go beep, 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 over a plant. If it can recognize that frequency, you might then be able to go, oh, this plant is stressed. What is it? Especially if they can kind of definitely say it's emitting these frequencies for this or this frequency for this, or even if they can't, just being able to get a frequency off the plant that might be screaming could give you kind of early warning signs. So again, I'll put it into context in terms of the houseplant word. Imagine a device like that. You can kind of take over a plant and go over it to just kind of go, this is stressed. If I know that this specific frequency is because it's lacking water, guess what I need to do? Because my plants just told me I need to water it. So it's things like that. Same thing with pests. Is it stressed because of pest? Is it, obviously, if something's just been cut, you wouldn't want to do the beep beep machine if you've just taken a cutting to take for a propagate, because the plant would probably be swearing at you at that point. There'd be a lot of high frequencies going on. But yeah, these are all really interesting bits of research that are coming out that could have huge implications, not just for the houseplant world, obviously, but predominantly on how some food crops are being grown for all of us. And as I said, eventually will probably trickle down to things like houseplants as well. So very, very, very interesting. And I will say the same thing that I said, I think I said this on my previous video. I'm very curious to see what this might mean, depending on how deep this research goes, what this might mean for people that are vegan or vegetarian, because they have an ethical issue against cognizant animals being killed in order to create food. What happens then in terms of the ethics? And I'm not expecting an answer, it's just more of a theoretical kind of what if situation. It comes out that all these plants are cognizant, and every time you're cutting down a plant, you are causing it immense amount of pain and all these things. So would vegans or vegetarians exist at that point? Because if it's on an ethical level and you can't eat meat for that reason, but plants go through a similar situation, what would you be eating at that point? But sorry, random kind of bit of a side note there, but I just, yeah. My brain works in weird ways, but what can I say? But hopefully this has been enjoyable and it hasn't just been me prattling on for a good 40 minutes. And hopefully this is something that's of interest. I think last time everybody was very keen for me to bring more of these videos out. Is that still the case? Did you enjoy this one as well? And I'll see if I can find any more weird plant researchy articles and kind of we can all discuss. But yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed. And if you think that this is a video and some information that somebody, friends, family, or anything like that might appreciate, do consider sharing this. It does help the channel grow, and I've been trying to grow this channel for this year, so I'm being proactive about this. Obviously, subscribe and like if you haven't already. And yeah, hopefully I shall see you all here soon. So I hope you have a great rest of your day and speak to you soon. Thanks. Bye.